All right, good evening, gentlemen. Sorry for the late start. We are on page 377 and 3/376. We are making our way through, slowly but surely, the final chapter of the Mimer here. We are eventually, sometime in the near future, with the help of God, going to finish this discourse. We're going to find other things to learn. We are still talking about time. Long story short, we have been outlining a connection between time and the unfolding of the spiritual worlds. In general, God creates the world through a process. He doesn't need to, but he does, as is explained in Kabbalah. And that process is a process of smaller and smaller gradations, as we've said over the past few weeks. In other words, you start, essentially, it's a bit like a pyramid. You start with one God who is truly infinite, and that infinitude and that truth of God is slowly removed to a greater and greater extent. And as that truth is removed, more and more multiplicity and division is created until we reach, so to speak, the lowest world, the lowest reality, which conceals God entirely, which is our reality, the physical world. Now, the divisions of godliness actually explain the notion of time, because as we've been saying at length, there are really three basic relationships to time. There is being within time, which is what is shared essentially more or less with the physical world, the spiritual worlds of Bria and Yetzirah. Everything that is below Malchus of Atzilus participates in actual time. The spiritual world, it's a little bit more spiritual. We spoke about that at length last week, how the time in Yetzirah, for example, a short amount of time in the world of Yetzirah is 15 years in our world. They have the time is less divided in the higher spiritual worlds, but essentially there is actual time there. And we explained that this is actually how the Baal Shem Tov was able to write to his brother-in-law about events that would happen in the future, because from the Baal Shem Tov's perspective, in his access to the world of Yetzirah, he could actually see that these things as they had already taken place, because he saw the time in its spiritual source, rather than experienced it only in the way that it unfolds in our physical world. Now, beyond Malchus of Atzilus, there's a second category. Generally, in the world of Atzilus and in the higher spiritual realms above the worlds, we have what is called Seder HaZman, the order of time, which is not literally time passing, as we understand it. Everything there happens simultaneously in terms of actual time. And yet there is still an order. There's a causal order to things. One thing follows the next. The way Rabbi Yoel puts it, famous Chabad Mashpia, is that in explicating a sugya of Talmud, in explicating a Torah passage, the maskana, or conclusion, always follows from the shakla v'tarya, from the argument. The argument never follows from the conclusion. In other words, the conclusion, by nature of being the conclusion, follows from the argument. The argument, by nature of being an argument, precedes the conclusion. And these things precede and follow each other, even on a static page of Talmud, in one moment in time, right? No time needs to pass for a conclusion to follow the argument. It's a similar thing, so too above, in an even more abstract way, in a way that's a bit harder to grasp. You have multiple spiritual levels which follow one from the other, even though they do not follow in time. This is called Seder HaZman, the order of time, and it is actually the source of actual time. The source of actual time is determined by the ebb and flow of these spiritual realities, which at the highest level is described as mati velo mati, the reaching and not reaching, or the extension and lack of extension of the world of Adam Kadmon, or the world of Akudim, the highest spiritual world. In the world of Adam Kadmon, of course, which we've been speaking about for at least 2 months now, in that reality of Adam Kadmon, the first revelation of God after the Tzimtzum, the world of Akudim, the primordial man, where all of the spheres are bound together, at that stage, all of time in its potential state, right? In the spiritual root of time exists at one glance. B'skira achas. Everything that was, is, and will be exists there all in one single unity. And it is that unity which is then unfolded into the order of time with the various spiritual emanations, and then when it's even further divided and brought down even lower into actual time. And ultimately the passage of one moment to the next is governed by the very refined and precise spiritual vessel through which this that is dominant at this time, and from moment to moment these spiritual energies switch. That's basically the summary of what we've said so far about time. So you have time, you have ordered time. Oh, and of course, beyond the world of Akudim, beyond the spiritual worlds, you have God himself. You have the Creator, and his relationship to time is that he has no relationship with time. He is absolutely beyond time. Not in a way of existing for eternity, like the skira achas of Adam Kadmon, like the single glance where everything exists all as one. That at least stands in relation to time. That is the source of time. God himself stands in no relation to time. He is beyond time utterly. He is truly eternal, outside of time. Time is in the Venn diagram you have time, and then God is on the outside. Right? God himself, Chaim. We're on page 376 on the third line. We're basically continuing this conversation. We're going to get into a few more details. We're actually going to talk, God willing, if we get far enough, about the relationship between Torah and time. And then, once we get through that, you have the very last little paragraph of the whole mimer, which is about very interesting things, such as God's foreknowledge and free will and how they can both exist, things like that. 3 lines from the top on 376. 4 lines, pardon me. Shakol tziruf. Every tziruf, a tziruf is an arrangement of godly powers, right? In other words, as we explained, the source of the nature of everything in our world is derivative of a combination of spheres, right? It's put in different ways. In our mimer, we said it's a combination of the different spheres, right? You have chesed, you have gvura of chesed, and you have tiferes of gvura of chesed, and you have chesed of tiferes of gvura of chesed, and so too, without end, to no foreseeable stopping point, you have combinations of different spheres, and in combination they lend certain characteristics to something until a specific combination of spheres generates the nature of each specific creation. That's one way you can put it. In Tanya, in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, the second part of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe talks about combinations of letters. He doesn't say spheres, he says letters. He's talking about the same idea, though. He's saying that in the creation of the world, God creates the world from the Asara Maimaros, right? The Asara Maimaros are the 10 utterances with which God creates the world, like let there be light, right? There's 7 days, but there's really 10 utterances. And these 10 utterances correspond as well to the 10 commandments, the Aseres Adibros, which come later. It's a whole story about the 10 utterances. God speaks 10 things to bring the world into being. And the Alter Rebbe explains how God speaks the 10 things, these 10 utterances, and these utterances are the vitality of everything that's within the world. So God says, let there be light, and so to speak, obviously speech is a metaphor, right? But the godly sustenance which is invested in the words, let there be light, is what actually becomes the existence of light and sustains them forever. It's a metaphor for God investing himself in the creation, of God emanating the existence of the specific reality. And the Alter Rebbe and Tanya there asks a simple question, right? That really any child, theoretically, who hears this explanation, if they think about it long enough, would ask the question. And the question is: there's many things in the world, obviously. In fact, there may be an infinite number of things in the world that are not mentioned in the 10 utterances in creation, right? God says, "Let there be light," and He says, "Let there be a firmament," but nowhere, I assure you, in the 10 utterances does it say, let there be, his example is a stone, an even, a stone of the ground. But there's many things that aren't mentioned. It doesn't say let there be dogs. It doesn't say let there be cats. It doesn't say let there be elm trees instead of oak trees, right? So even if you want to say that elm trees and oak trees are both implicit in when it says God said let there be the sprouting trees of the field and the grasses of the ground, and you would say that elm and oak are included in that. The question is, but where does the division between the types come from, right? The tree, there's a huge range of behaviors and natures in trees. So when you say God said let there be trees, the utterance, which is actually creating the trees, seems to make no distinction between the types at all. They should all be universally the same, according to this theory. According to this theory is the wrong word. According to this explanation, according to this doctrine, that it's the words of God that actually become the creation. So the question is, if the words of God become the creation, and God says let there be a tree, so where does the division between an elm tree and an oak tree come from? There should just be one type of tree. Right, and so too, examples abound. You can, with any statement, any of the 10 Maimaros, you can think of what about this thing that doesn't seem to be included but is in the world. The example Alter Rebbe uses is a stone, Evan. Nowhere is a stone mentioned. Where does a stone come from? In the creation. It says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. He created the heaven and the earth. So you might say earth includes stone, but where does the actual existence of the stone come from? Because again,
is Earth
a
planet or is Earth?
That's also a fair question, right? So if Earth refers to something else, if Earth just means the worldly realm or physicality in general, then it's even further removed from a stone. Then we don't even know where the ground comes from in general.
Light.
So God speaks and his utterance becomes these things. So where do you get the things that aren't mentioned? The Alter Rebbe explains at the end, I believe, of chapter 1 of the second part of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe explains that letters, as we know, letters of Torah, are not just the letters that they appear to be on the surface. Because God says, let there be light. Vayehi ur. But ur has, the aleph vav resh, the Hebrew word for light, has a numerical value. It has certain gematria associations with other letters. For example, so first of all, it has a numerical value in gematria, right? It's equivalent to numbers. And we know that there's an ancient Hebrew art of numerology called gematria, where the quantity of the word equals other things, and this indicates a sort of connection between them. Then there's other things. There's also something called atbash that you may have heard of. It's a different form of gematria where the words are exchanged, the letters are exchanged by their equivalent distance from the end of the alphabet. So for example, like the very famous cipher, like A for Z and Z for A, so you have atbash. It's called atbash because aleph is to taf and beis is to shin, right? The beginning, the first and last letter, and the second and second to last letter, etc., right? And through that there's also connections. I once met a rabbi in Jerusalem who told me, your name is Tzvi. Tzvi is atbash of Moshe. Right? So Tzvi and Moshe are names that are connected to one another, right? Different things like that. There's different connections between words that way, and that's also a legitimate Torah connection. In other words, the Torah teaches us that implicit in its own words, when it says one word, there's many other words, and then you get to there's other exchanges. There's exchanges by the part of the mouth that the word is said by. The letters are grouped into the letters that come from the palate, and the letters that come from the teeth, and the letters that come from the throat. Then there's also the miluyim of the letters, right? Because an aleph isn't just the letter aleph, it's also aleph lamed pei, which spells out the letter aleph, right? Is also implicit in the aleph, right? The name of the aleph is implicit in the aleph. And when you start adding all of these things together, it turns out that that one word can contain the entire universe, which is in fact the case, really, in what it says about Torah, that the world was created with 10 utterances. And those 10 utterances, where does everything else come from? And the divisions between everything else comes from the exchanges and the combinations and the switching of the letters. Implicit in the letters of those things were all of these exchanges.
Is there a word? Is there a word with the highest value?
I don't think words have a set length. You might say, is there a word in the Torah with the highest value? That's an interesting question. In the actual written Torah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Obviously, there's no word with a set highest value because you could just keep adding letters, right? You'd have to say a real word, right?
When you add a letter, it's, 1 + 2 to...
There's different letters have different values. Taf has the most.
Which is?
400. 400 is the highest, unless once you start gematria, it becomes complicated because there's also the finishing letters, which are sometimes put at the end, right? Because there's 5 letters in Hebrew, I believe, that at the end of a word they have a final form, right?
There's no word that's a million gazillion.
No, you would think not, right? No real word. That's what I'm saying. So the question then becomes, what's a real word? So that's why I said the word with the highest value in Torah is a good question. I don't know. And of course, the exchanges aren't just done with words, they're done with whole phrases, right? Like, for example, very famously, there's the law in Purim, now we're getting really far afield. There's a law in Purim that you're supposed to drink, no problem, that you're supposed to drink until you can no longer distinguish between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. Cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, right? You're supposed to drink until you can no longer distinguish between them. And there's many teachings about why this is the case, what's the meaning of this, and all these different things. But the bottom line is, an interesting little fact, is that Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai have the same gematria, which is astonishing the first time you hear it. I actually still find it kind of astonishing. They have the same gematria. Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, these two things which you're supposed to drink enough so that you can't tell the difference between them, right? They have the same numerical value, the two phrases, which actually leads some halachic authorities, by the way, which is an interesting... Normally, gematria and halacha have nothing to do with one another. Normally, gematria and Jewish law are two very separate realms of Torah study. But in this case, there are actually some authorities which say, what is the actual halachic measure in Jewish law that you have drank enough that you can no longer calculate the gematrias of Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai? And that's what's implied by the words of the Talmud. Anyway, that was an aside. So... yeah.
It's made up of the letters. What about the vowels?
The vowels is a very good question. So there's actually 4 things, believe it or not. Now you want to know the rest of the story. There's really 4 things. The letters. The Alter Rebbe only mentions the letters in Tanya. So that's why I'm talking about the letters. And the written Torah, in fact, only has letters explicitly. Right? There are no vowels or anything else. It's just letters. Letters and spaces. Right? Which is interesting. Some people say that the white space of Torah is the rest of the letters. Right? Very famously, it says that there's 600,000 letters in the Torah, but if you count them, it's not even half that much. And so the question becomes, what's the saying of the Talmud that there's 600,000 letters in Torah? And one of the explanations is that the white spaces count as well. The negative spaces, if you knew how to calculate, there's a whole wisdom of calculating the negative spaces, and if you could calculate the negative spaces, you would see that the total sum is 600,000. It's another interesting thing you may not know. So there's really 4 things which the Kabbalah speaks about at great length. Not so much Chassidus. I wouldn't say I've seen many Maimarim about this, but Kabbalah talks about it. There's 4 different things, if I'm not mistaken. There's the letters. There's the cantillation marks, which we know also come with the Torah, the song of the Torah that comes with it, which is actually the source for the original translators of the Torah of punctuation. That's the Torah's punctuation, is in the cantillation. Because there's definitely, as you can see, if you read the Torah, you can see that certain marks are definitely meant to be periods or end of sentences and things like that, although they don't fall always where the verse ends, which is also weird. Because the verse ends were not... where the verses end is not part of the same reckoning. It's very strange. Also, where the parsha ends doesn't follow where the white gaps are in the Torah. Always it's a whole thing. So you have the letters, you have the cantillation marks, you have the vowels, the nekudes, and you have the ksarim, the crowns that are on the letters. If you actually look in the Sefer Torah, you see that certain letters have crowns, right? They have little it's hard to describe them, sort of little spikes on top. Yeah.
With
So there's traditions about all the different letters, which letters have spikes, how many. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva would learn mountains of halachas from the crowns on the letters. I don't know what that means or how he did that, but that is what it says. So there's really 4 things in the text of the Torah. The actual text of the Torah contains 4 aspects. You have letters, vowels, cantillation marks, and crowns. Only the letters are actually written in the Torah scroll. But all the other 3 are also connected to the written Torah. They're also inalterable and part of the tradition. In other words, they're not oral. They're not part of the oral Torah. They're part of the written Torah, but they're the unwritten part of the written Torah, which is weird. That's part of what's interesting about them. Anyway, so that whole thing was an aside. So what's the significance of the Alter Rebbe saying, back to the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that the letters in combination is what creates the individual things. So the elm tree and the oak tree, as the Alter Rebbe explains there, they each have a true Hebrew name, which may not be what they're called in modern Hebrew, by the way. They have a true Hebrew name which defines the spiritual, essentially the spiritual source that makes them what they are. And they are that combination of letters. And those letters don't appear in the 10 utterances, but they appear in the combinations and the gematrias and the exchanges of letters. Eventually these names come out. And the Alter Rebbe, there's a couple of things to note about this. The first thing to note about this is that you therefore have, so to speak, primary explicit creations, and you have implicit creations. In other words, you have 10 categories of things which God actually explicitly creates in the text of the Torah, and then you have other things which are only derivatives or ride on those initial statements, right? In terms of how you arrive at the actual creation, right? Or, light is mentioned explicitly. Even, a stone, is only implicit. Even is not mentioned in the words, even though it's created from combinations of those letters. The Alter Rebbe then goes one step further and he says the second thing. He says that the spiritual life force, the energy, the godly expression within the creation can be measured, almost in a sense, you could say, it's really qualitative, but you could almost say quantified, by its distance from the direct text of the Torah. In other words, the greatest creations, the creations which are created most directly and have the most godly sustenance, which are most directly connected to their soul, are mentioned explicitly. And if you'll note, most of them are general creations. In other words, God doesn't say, I create a clownfish. He says, I create the fish of the sea. Right? So there is the fish in the sea are, so to speak, a large enough creation, a general enough creation, that they can actually be created directly by the word of God, so to speak. In other words, the fish in the sea as a general category, as a genus, as we would say in science, right? As a category, the fish in the sea have one collective soul, and that soul is a very high expression of godliness. Right? They collectively are connected to one of the 10 spheros. The divisions and the differences between the different types of fish are not connected to as high an expression of godliness, and they derive their souls from a further division, a further lessening of that light. So in other words, you have a hierarchy of sorts. Not necessarily better and worse per se, but you have a creation that, so to speak, can withstand, or a better term is that can instantiate a direct expression of godly creation. And then you have smaller categories, more specific realities, where those realities are only derivative. They only piggyback, ride on those initial expressions. So this hierarchy is actually also related to time, as we're going to say in our mimer. So where we've been talking about combinations of spheros, really combinations of spheros and the exchanges and combinations of different letters that the Alter Rebbe is talking about in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah is really the same thing. Of course, the 10 utterances, each one of the 10 utterances corresponds to a different sphera, right? And then the utterances being combined are the combinations of the spheros and the different exchanges of the letters, etc. So really we're talking about the same thing. And essentially, what we are explaining, what all of this comes to explain, essentially, is the pyramid nature of the process of the world's creation that I was talking about at the beginning of the class. Why is it that we go from one God and then into further and further multiplicity? And the answer is that the world, which is created, remember, to be separate from God and to conceal godliness, the world, therefore, must be a place of multiplicity, must be a place of plurality. And the more multiplicitous it is, the more complex it is, the harder it is to see how it is all the expression of one absolutely simple God. So essentially, the world, in order to be the world as God desires it to be, which is the world that we know that essentially covers over the nature of God, The world as we know it must be a place of division, because God is one, and the world is meant to be the opposite of God. So the world is a place of division and multiplicity. However, here's the other side. There's always two sides to this equation. In the Chassidic understanding of God's creation of the world, there's two sides to the equation. The first side is that the world must conceal God. The other side is that the truth of the world, in all of its details, must be godly. So in other words, the concealment of God, which appears to the naked eye, is really an illusion of sorts. That the fact that the world covers over God and is independent of God is in fact not its true reality at all. The true reality of the world is that each and every individual creation, in its nature, reflects a godly source and reflects an expression of God. So, on the one hand, the world is a place of multiplicity, and that multiplicity is meant to conceal God. On the other hand, that multiplicity, there must be a way to see in that multiplicity one God in everything. Every single detail and aspect of the world must be totally united with godliness. In order to explain how this is possible, how you can have a world of multiplicity that is also united with God, you have to understand the system whereby the process of the world's creation, whereby God is unified first with 10 spheres, first with somewhat limited utterances, limited expressions. And then, from those limited expressions and limited utterances, he then goes on to be united with the combinations of those expressions in the world. So in short, the world must have multiplicity, but that multiplicity, because it is to be united with God, and because you're supposed to understand how that multiplicity is united with God, it does not arise on its own. It comes out of a system. There's a system which creates it. And because there is a system which creates it, you are able to understand it. Systems are things we can understand. There's a system whereby God is united with the world in the nature of each and every thing. There's other ways where God is united with the world in Chassidus, by the way, but this is one of them, that He's united with the nature of each and everything. Each and everything is nothing but an expression of God. And the way by which you are able to understand how each and everything is an expression of God is because each and everything is created in a systematic way from God's unity, which you can understand with the help of the Kabbalah at every stage of the process. You understand how there's one God, then you understand how the world of Akudim is emanated, right? You don't know what Akudim is, but you can understand the process at least. Then later on you can understand how there's an Atzilus, where there's 10 spheres, and those spheres are comprised of light and vessel, as we spoke about at great length in this mimer. And then you understand how those 10 spheres, which are expressions of God but are also limited, can then be recombined and go on to create the nature of each and everything. And from this process, which is a multi-step process, through this system, you can understand how the nature of each and every specific thing is united with God. So in other words, this whole process, this whole, so to speak, pyramid, which goes from one God to a world of nearly infinite complexity and multiplicity, that the gap is bridged. God and the world are united by this idea, the idea that God speaks 10 utterances, and those 10 utterances, in turn, in combination, create the multiplicity of the world. So really, the spheres are the key. The spheres are the intermediate stage. The spheres of Atzilus, mostly is what we're talking about, are the intermediate stage, the godliness between God and the world, which is, as I've mentioned at least 1,000 times by now, the theme of our entire discourse. The theme of our entire discourse is that you have a world, you have God who is totally beyond knowledge, which is essentially the idea of faith in God. God is totally beyond understanding. But the God who is beyond understanding and the world that you can know are actually united. There's actually a way in which they interact. And in fact, the things that we can know and the God that we cannot know are in fact one. That the world is an expression of God. Knowledge and faith are not really two separate things, they're really one thing. And that's really the theme of our mimer, of course. That God who is beyond, the God of faith, the God who is totally undefined. In our specific chapter, we're speaking it all in terms of time. The God who is beyond time utterly, and the world which is totally within time, are really united by an intermediary reality called the order of time, Seder HaZman, and the order of time is the source of time. And therefore, God, even though he is beyond time, he is also united with time. Right? They're not two separate things. It's not two separate domains. The world is not a totally separate and independent reality from God, God forbid, but is rather an expression of God, even though God himself is totally beyond time. So that's really the point.
So the Venn diagram has a tangency.
It's more complicated than it appears. You have time. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. You have time, and you have God who is outside of time, and we don't compromise on either of those two things. However,
it's not a real tangency because God would envelop the smaller circle.
Yes, that's true, and it's also true that God is also the piece of paper, which is a different topic for a different day. That's tzimtzum like pshuta. There's no that the whole thing is illusory, but that's a different way that God is united with the world, not the way I'm talking about. I'm talking about what's called in Chassidus mamale kolamin, the lowest way in which God is united with the world, as its indwelling creator and life force of everything that exists, which is what it's explaining at the beginning of part 2 of Tanya that I was talking about before. So, time, God is completely outside of time, but time is nothing other than an expression of God. Yes, God is completely outside time, but time is nothing other than an expression of God. That's how we would put it. So, yes.
Who is God disguising himself from?
Pardon?
Who is God disguising himself from?
It depends on what level you're asking the question. Well, what do you mean?
Well, you keep saying that he's disguising himself
Yeah.
from us and all that, but is it just us or is it other?
Well, really, at one level, the real mystical answer would be to say that God is concealing himself from himself. That there's God is of two minds on himself. There's God who is of the mind that he is all that is, and there's God who is of the mind that there is a world. And these two perspectives of God, which are mentioned in Chassidus as Das Elyon and Das Tachton, and which I do believe we did talk about for a few classes at some point in this mimer. Those two perspectives are the whole. They're so to speak in tension, and all of creation is to relieve the tension, so to speak. In the times of Mashiach, the tension will be relieved. That God's view of himself as beyond the world and God's view of himself as within the world will really be shown to be one. That there's no difference between them. God is beyond the world, God is within the world. There's only one God, right? Which is the point of Judaism. So. That's one way of answering it. A different way of answering it is very simple: is that God is concealed. God is concealed from us. God is concealed from the world itself. You could view the world as an entity in this, right? The only thing is that it's complicated in Kabbalah because it is God's concealment from the world that creates the world. Right? So it's not that the world is pre-existing and then God conceals himself from it. It's almost the opposite. God conceals himself from the implicit end of the process of him concealing himself, and the implicit end of that process becomes the world. Right? It makes your head spin a little bit, just a bit. Really, there's a whole other topic, which we were speaking about, I think, back in chapter 4 of this mimer, back in the Dark Ages, about the unity of the knower, the knowledge, and the known, of God and the object of his knowledge and the knowledge itself, which really touches on this topic, because you would say, who is God concealing himself from? And the answer is himself. And by what is he concealed? By himself. Right? There's a three-directional unity. There is the world, which is what is created from his concealment. There is his act of concealment, and there is he who is doing the concealment. And those three things are absolutely one in the world of Atzilus. That's what we said back in chapter 4, in less confusing words. Right? The world, when we say the world is an object of his concealment, but the world is really the instantiation of his concealment, and both his concealment, both his act of concealment and the instantiation of his concealment are both perfect reflections of himself. So you have him, the act of concealment, and the thing which is created through concealing himself, and those three things are absolutely one in the world of Atzilus. A different way of saying it, in a way that fits more with the Kabbalistic language and makes people less uncomfortable, is that there is the light, which is his representative in this exchange. There is the vessel, which is the object that is created, so to speak. And there is the unity of light and vessel, which is the means by which one becomes or expresses the other. And these three things in the world of Atzilus are absolutely one. So if you ask deep questions, you get deep answers. That's the takeaway from that whole conversation. Let's
never asked it in chapter 4.
Well, in chapter 4 we said it in a different way that wasn't as obviously strange. That's what Chassidus is like. The first time you learn it is just to acquaint yourself with the words. It's really the second time that things start to sound strange. We're on line 4 of page 376. Every arrangement of sphirus, or every combination of letters, in order that its life, that its life-giving sustenance, its life force, should be invested in this world. In other words, in order that the word, the Hebrew soul of an elm tree, which is a certain word, certain combination of letters, or a combination of sphirus, should actually become the soul of the elm tree, for example, they must be divided into many small portions, as I was explaining to you before, in order that the interval of a single hour can be brought about from the divine energies. In other words, the energy, as I explained before, is initially emanated in spheres. The spheres correspond to millennia, as we said earlier, thousands of years in their source. Each sphere is a source of 1,000 years, of a millennium. And that energy, that soul, that life force must be further transformed down, must be brought down so that it can be the life force of a single hour through these various combinations and permutations. Lafi kibbutz hatzimtzum v'espashtus shel kol chelek, that each, according to the specific contraction and extension of each part. In other words, remember, it is the process of tzimtzum and of contraction and then the emanation of light, which is the life pulse of the world. We compared it to the human breath, right, in and out. The life pulse, which actually creates time, is the same process whereby each specific combination, each specific light, each specific emanation for that time is emanated in a different way, according to the nature of the contraction and then the light, right? That this pulse is what determines both the passage of time and the various natures of the source of time, of the soul of each moment, is also determined by this pulse, by the mati v'lo mati, the ratzei v'shuv, the light and the tzimtzum, the light and the contraction. This is what actually emanates one soul after another soul after another soul, and each one of these souls is the source of a moment, and that is the passage of time. Shashavezman rega, and so it must be very contracted that each one of these emanations and contractions exists a single moment of time. And through from the collection of moments, his hava meshach shah, a whole hour comes into being.
Before you go into
yes,
speaking about an hour,
yeah.
Is that unit of time derived from anything in the Torah, or was it just part of how civilization figured things out?
Well, the Torah, generally speaking, in general, uses halachic hours, which were part of the oral Torah, wherein the day is divided into 12 portions between sunrise and sunset. So the hours are not actually 60 minutes on our clocks. The hours could be shorter or longer depending what time of year it is. Right? So if the day is very long, like in the summer, and the night is short, so the day hours are longer, right? The hour can actually be 74 minutes or whatever it is on the longest day of the year at the The longest day of the year is the summer solstice, right? That's when it's longest. The only days when the halachic hour is exactly 60 minutes long is at the equinox, spring and autumn, right? That's much more connected to nature.
The equator.
Yeah, the whole whatever the reckoning is, right? So that's how the halachic hour, the halachic time is determined, which is why one of the reasons why the different halachic times change very specifically depending on where you are, right? Like the latest time for saying Shema in Atlanta is not the same as the latest time for saying Shema in Charleston, even though we're in the same time zone or whatever. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's the source. That's the halachic hour. That's the source of it. It comes from the oral Torah, as far as I know, and it's.
But there was a unit, 12.
Yeah, 12. The unit is part of it.
How was that 12 derived?
That's a good question. I don't know. The Rambam may talk about it, I'm not sure, in Mishnah Torah, where he talks about the establishment of the months. He may speak about that.
Since we're going
I can't
to
remember.
discuss time,
Yeah,
we have to know what
right.
the metric is.
That's true. Well, the metric is known. The source of the metric is more mysterious. 12 hours is universal in Torah. I don't know about anywhere else.
It's mentioned specifically?
Yes. Yeah,
There's a lot of 12s.
that's true.
So it was probably a common number that was used.
I don't know where it comes from. It's a good question. Kizeu klal gadol. This is the general principle, says the Tzemach Tzedek on the third line of page 379. Shekola shefa tismashech lamata yoser. That however lower a divine influence or a flow of divine energy proceeds, muchreches lischolik b'yoser. It must further divide. It must further become more divided. Kamei, what's the metaphor? It's like haner sheb'mekemei, the light of a candle in its place. In other words, you have a candle in one corner of the room, for example. Hu machzik makai muat. The candle takes up a small amount of space. Va'era hamispashim mimenu mamale makom gadol. The light which extends from this candle fills a much greater space. Kabai zuchiyetzevechen, like an entire house or the like. This is a very strange metaphor, and I don't understand what this metaphor means exactly. I mean, I understand the basic point of the metaphor, but the rest of the details of the metaphor are very strange. The basic point of the metaphor is that the emanation, like a physical emanation of light, which is a common metaphor, for the godly emanation, the physical emanation can start in one very small space, but as it extends further over time, it fills up more and more space until a single candle can light a whole house, right? So he's saying, similarly, the initial godly emanation in its source, so to speak, you can have 1,000 years in one emanation, and then as that emanation, so to speak, permeates through the lower worlds, so it becomes further and further divided. The light becomes more and more diffused. I don't really understand what the spiritual diffusion of light over space means in the analog. So don't ask me questions, I don't know. But that's the metaphor. The metaphor is you have a candle, and the light of the candle spreads out and becomes more diffused as it gets further from its source. He says, so too with the godly emanation. In Atzilus it starts as one united point which contains 1,000 years, and then it actually gets more and more diffuse until every moment is actually separate from one another in the physical world. And he has another metaphor. So too with a teacher and a student. That when this is in a way, this is a more understandable metaphor for me personally. That when he desires to bring his intellect lower to a relatively lower student, right? Like my teacher in yeshiva always used to say, Einstein has to teach elementary school math, right? That was always his example. He is forced to invest in many words and many things in order to divide his intellect, in order that his student should be able to understand it. In other words, the actual thought as it is in the mind of the teacher is unified. The thought is one. Einstein does not have when Einstein thinks about, I don't know, the sum of the angles of the triangle equals 180 or whatever it is, he's not thinking about this with metaphors and explanations and diagrams and charts. He simply has the information, right? It's as one point. but in order that a student in a lower place should be able to grasp that one single point which he has, because the student is so much lower, which this is really the metaphor of diffusal over space in the physical metaphor, which is much harder for me to understand. Because the student is much lower, because he's in a lower space in a spiritual sense, so the teaching, which is one in the mind of the teacher, can only be conveyed by dividing it up into many, many, many words, many small pieces of meaning, right? Because the truth is, of course, that the student is not able to, if the student cannot directly hear the intellect, he cannot directly hear the idea, you can't transfer your thought to your student. It has to be transferred in pieces of meaning, in words, and each word corresponds to something that the student already knows, because the student has to know what the words mean, right? So the student already knows what a triangle is, and he may already know what an angle is, and he may already know what certain numbers are, and all these different things. And you have to convey this concept in many, many words and explanations and diagrams and all these things, in order that this thing which is one in the mind of the teacher, which isn't even in words in the mind of the teacher, is really just a pure spiritual thought in the mind of the teacher, can be conveyed to the student. So the Rebbe says, as the metaphor with the spheros and with time, that generally speaking, as godly emanations get lower and lower, as godly emanations go to a lower and lower place in a spiritual sense, right? In other words, as they become more and more worldly, as they become more and more separate from God, they have to spread out. They have to become more divided. What to the mind of God is one single idea, one single sphera, which contains 1,000 years, to the mind of the world is actually occurs in many, many, many moments. It cannot occur all at once, because the world, so to speak, cannot receive that godly expression. This is directly connected to everything I was saying earlier about how there's 10 primary utterances, which the creations which can instantiate that amount of godliness, right? But the individual creations, which are lower, they're like the lower student who cannot accept that much godliness, who their nature is simply too low to have access to that high level of godliness. So it has to come down through further and further levels. It's the same idea. So the general, this is the Tzemach Tzedek's explanation of the general principle that as the divine flow and the divine expression gets lower, it has to become more divided. And he says, and what's the proof? Because when the teacher has to teach a smarter student, when he's no longer trying to teach a freshman in high school about a concept, but rather he's teaching one of his graduate students in college about the same concept, he doesn't have to speak so many words. For the higher level class, much more is automatically understood. You don't have to say so many words to convey the new topic. Nimtza hamuat machzik hamaruba kichlal, and thus, as the rule says, the rule from the Midrash is that about the Torah, the way the Torah works, the Midrash says the Torah is a muat hamachzik es hamaruba. The Torah is a small thing which contains a big thing. It's a small thing which holds. It's like what's it called from Doctor Who, right? It's bigger on the inside. Ever see that show? It has a time-traveling toll booth, and on the inside it's gigantic. It's like a whole spaceship. And on the outside, it's just a toll booth, right? So it's bigger on the inside. That's what they always say. It's the same thing. You have the small thing contains a big thing, right? This is like how we were saying last week that Rosh Hashanah contains within it the entire year, even though it's only one day, because at the level of the higher emanation, at the level where Rosh Hashanah is emanated, which is not at the level of actual so to speak, lowest reality that we normally occupy, where Rosh Hashanah is emanated, 365 days fit into one day. In other words, it's at this higher stage. Things are not as divided. Things have not yet come apart as much. It's more unified. And so that is how it's a muat hamachzik es hamaruba. One day contains many days, because really the many days are only an effect of the further division of the light, the further division of the godly expression. Kechlal lefrat. It is the higher level is like the general principle which has many particulars. That's another explanation of Torah, description of Torah. V'chein hamachshava l'gabei hadibur, a third metaphor. So too, thought in comparison to speech. Shemashe yachzik b'machshava berega, that what you can think in a moment, yitztarich b'dibur l'shoy zman rav l'farsha. It sometimes takes a long time to explain in speech. A person can get an insight, even in, this is talking about the person's own mind and speech, right? It's a different metaphor. Not a teacher speaking to a student, but a person with their own mind. The mind, which is more spiritual and more refined than speech in general, can grasp something which it takes a long time to say in a moment. Right, you grasp in a single second, right? Like the very famous story that the Rebbe Rashab conceived of the Tzemach Vav, which is a mimer that's this thick in the book. Right? It's a gigantic mimer, a whole Chassidic discourse, massive with incredible details. Just goes on forever. It's just the detail and the amount that's said and about many different topics. And the whole idea came to him in just a few moments. The Frierdiker Rebbe actually tells the story of when the Rebbe Rashab told him, he thought of the whole mimer of Tzemach Vav. But in words, it's a whole book. It takes more than a year to learn at the regular speed. It's a whole thing.
It's like solving the problem in the shower.
Yeah, like solving the problem in the shower, exactly. And also in general, when you think of a new idea, sometimes you have it. You have the idea and you have it, but to put it into words sometimes takes much longer. It's the same idea, that as you get more spiritual and as you get more refined and more close to how things truly are at essence, it takes less time and less division to convey those things. So thought is inherently less divided than speech. The teacher's idea is inherently less divided than it is when he has to give it over to the student. The candle is in one place, but the light to fill the whole room has to spread out to great distances. It's all the same metaphor. It's all a metaphor for the same thing. Pardon me. Let's do the top page 381. We'll finish soon. The nimtza muvan mizel kapanim. We find from all of the above, at least, shesibas ischalkus hashafa usibas ishavus hazman. That what causes the divine flow to be divided into smaller portions, that is the cause of the creation of time. V'kol she'ashefa hi be'eskalus yeser, and the more that the divine flow the more the divine flow is in a general state, as a gam hazman nichlal sham chalakim b'rabim ke'echad kanal. Time is included within it, many parts as one. You have greater and greater amounts of time that are included in these emanations. Until you find that in the general light we mentioned before, nichlal hakol ke'echad, in the world of Ak, in the world of Akudim, Adam Kadmain, in the highest, the first emanation after the Tzimtzum, everything is included there, all as one. V'machshava achas v'skira achas. That's God's one thought and one glance, which includes everything past, present, and future. Right? Shakal al man kanal. It includes all of time, as we said before. Let's stop here. I was happy to go further, but we'll do it next week, God willing. We'll stop here.
We're going to finish next week?
No, not a chance. Very.
And then the following week on the way.
Very unlikely. We'll probably finish on the week here. We'll probably finish on the week here away. Don't worry, it's good. You'll miss the parting is such sweet sorrow. You'll come back. We'll already have started a new thing. We'll have moved on. We'll have turned over a new leaf.
And
it's
you won't
good.
put it on YouTube already. Very frustrating.
You know how it is.